Today, I'm going to share 3 stories about real people who at some point in their lives made choices that at the time seemed sort of insignificant, but over time, those choices would drastically not only change their lives, but in some cases, the lives of millions and millions of other people as well. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all their toilet paper with sandpaper. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. In the spring of 1986, a 22-year-old man named Will walked across the campus of the University of Missouri. Will was just a few months away from graduating from that university with a bachelor's degree in journalism. But recently, he was starting to feel like he actually didn't want to be a journalist after all. He didn't have any real passion for journalism. However, he did have passion for Hollywood movies. Will had lived in Missouri his whole life, and now he was, going to college in Missouri as well, so he was pretty sheltered, hadn't really gone anywhere. So for him, movies had sort of been like this magical portal into a different world. Hollywood would show him all these amazing places and people, and so that was his escape. He loved Hollywood movies. And so with Will's senior year coming to a close in just a few months with, real life right there on the horizon, Will sort of had this big revelation that he simply didn't want to be a journalist. And in fact, what he was going to do is just drop out of college, literally weeks away from his degree, and move to California, to Hollywood, to actually pursue being an actor in Hollywood movies. But despite Will's incredible enthusiasm and naivete, when he got to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, he realized that he was not the only young person with this big dream. There were loads of aspiring actors and actresses who loved Hollywood and wanted to break in that were here, basically competing for all the same roles in all the same films. Now, this didn't deter Will. He wasn't totally shocked. Of course, people wanted to be big movie stars and come out here and try their hand. And so he went out and auditioned constantly. He didn't care what movie it was. He wanted to be in one, but he just was not getting the work. Nobody was picking him up. He was auditioning and being rejected over and over and over again. And Will was okay with that. He figured, okay, I'll get better and eventually get cast for something. But the problem was his finances. It was expensive to live in Los Angeles, and there really weren't all that many jobs available. During the day, Will really wanted to focus on just auditioning constantly, and so the only work he could reasonably take was sort of side gigs that he could work late at night or early in the morning. Except, again, there's so many people trying to do what Will is doing, aspiring actors and actresses, that basically all the side gigs in LA were sort of already taken. And so the only ones that were available to Will were like the bottom of the barrel side gigs, the ones nobody wanted. But, Will was determined and he was okay taking whatever was available. And so he ultimately got 2 jobs. He worked as a mascot for a fast food chicken restaurant where he basically would stand outside in a chicken suit and try to encourage people to go into the restaurant. And then at night, he would work as a limo driver, but for a very specific group of people. He was a limo driver for strippers who would go mostly to bachelor parties, and it was Will's job to drive them to and from these parties, and then also to go in with them and, sort of be the DJ, play some music for them. And then at the end of the night, he was in charge of picking up all the money and clothes that were kind of strewn about from the event and packaging it all up, putting everybody and everything back in the limo, and driving him back home again. Now, at first, Will just sort of accepted that this was his life, because eventually it was not going to be his life. He was going to break into Hollywood, and he wouldn't have to wear the chicken suit or drive the strippers around anymore. He could just be an actor, and he could do the thing he really wanted to do. But pretty quickly, Will realized that The opportunity to break in just wasn't really happening. But what was really happening is he was spending a lot of his time being the chicken suit guy and driving strippers around, because he had to pay his bills and these jobs didn't pay very much. And so he had to kind of encroach on the daytime hours and work more hours during that time that he would like to be auditioning just to pay his bills. And then when he would audition, he just continued not to get cast. And so before long, it just sort of felt like he was working these two kind of awful jobs all the time, barely sleeping, so that he could just get rejected over and over and over again and not break into Hollywood? It was depressing. And ultimately what he decided to do was, you know what? I'm gonna quit one of my jobs. He decided he would quit the limo stripper job and just do the chicken suit job to buy a little bit more time during the day so he could audition a little bit more, and for a little while he would just put all of his effort into that and hopefully land a big spot. And if he didn't, well, then his big dream likely was not gonna pan out and he'd have to move back home. But on Will's final shift as a stripper driver, one of the strippers actually said something to him that totally changed his life. He was driving him around on their way to bachelor parties, doing this and that. And at some point, Will struck up a conversation with this woman. She was a stripper, but during the day, she too was trying to become an actress. Stripping was her side gig to make enough money to live in LA to try to break into the industry. It wasn't going great for her, but, she was enthusiastic and committed the same way Will was. And over the course of this conversation, she told Will that, in addition to auditioning and, working when you had to, you should also take this particular acting class. There's this one great class that all the biggest and best aspiring actors and actresses are taking, and lots of very successful actors and actresses have taken. Like, this is the one to get into. You really ought to divert some of your time during the day to going to this class. And for Will, he appreciated the input, but he's thinking like, that's not really gonna help me. Right now, I don't need to learn how to act. That's gonna take way too long. Like, I don't need that. I need action. I need to audition. I need to just be given a role, and then my training will be on the job. I'll learn by acting, not by training to act. However, he's also thinking to himself as he's driving around all night and she's talking about how great this class is, that he's like, you know what? At the same time though, my auditions have not gone well. Nothing's really going well. And so maybe I'll just go to this class once. I mean, she's gonna be there. She wants me to go. I'll go with her. I'll go one time, maybe it'll be good for me. And so he agrees to go. And so not long after this final shift where he has this sort of pivotal interaction with the stripper, he goes to the acting class, and the stripper is there and she's so excited to see him, and he makes his way in and he sits down, and at some point during the class, the instructor says, okay, we're gonna pair you up with other people in the class, and you're gonna act out a scene in front of everybody else. And so Will, he randomly gets paired up with this other actor who in fact had a real audition that night. The scene they were gonna act out was actually gonna be done in front of actual agency reps who had come to this class. They were there literally to see this other actor do this particular scene. Will was just being asked to basically play support and allow this other actor to do their scene and hopefully get the part. And Will knows this. He's like going into this with, okay, I'm gonna read these lines and you're gonna kind of be the one really auditioning here. And it'll be in front of the whole class. It'll be, both cool to see a real audition and good exposure to the folks that are in the class. And so they do this scene, and Will, who really is just trying to play a good supporting person here, is so unbelievably talented. He's so into the scene. His emotions come through so beautifully that he completely overshadows the other actor. Like, he completely destroys them and comes out looking like the star that really he thought he was. And the agency reps were so blown away by it, they actually didn't cast the other actor who was supposed to be auditioning for this role. They basically said, no, we're not interested in you. We're gonna cast Will in this role. Will basically stole the role from this other actor. And this moment would end up being so talked about and so iconic that this virtual nobody stole the show and landed this role. that people began talking about Will in Hollywood, and wouldn't you know it, it led to his big break. Will began getting cast left and right as the lead actor, the starring role in Hollywood hit after Hollywood hit. Today, Will is one of the most famous and celebrated movie stars to have ever lived. He's won everything from Academy Awards and Golden Globes to People Magazine's Sexiest Man Alive. Will is his first name, but he's better known by his middle name, Brad Pitt. In early April of 1945, a 15-year-old girl named Etta curled up on a pile of blankets inside the basement of her aunt's house in Velp, which is a small town in the Netherlands. Etta's stomach hurt so badly, and she felt weaker than she ever had in her whole life, and this was because she was quite literally on the brink of starving to death. Etta was 5 foot 6 inches tall, but her weight had plummeted to just 88 pounds. She couldn't walk, she couldn't stand, and she could barely speak. She was probably within a couple of days of actually dying. And despite the fact that, her aunt and her mother were right down there with her in the basement, along with some other refugees that her family was housing in the basement with them, nobody had food to give her. And so as much as they wanted to help her, they couldn't. And on top of that, making this already terrible situation even worse, Etta, her family, and the refugees had literally been trapped down here in this basement, for months because it was way too dangerous to go outside. That's part of the reason they couldn't get food. Going outside was a death sentence in and of itself. Because World War II was raging right outside. Bombs are being dropped, people are being shot, explosions left and right. They're totally trapped. So the country where Etta lived, the Netherlands, had been under Nazi occupation for almost 5 years at this point. When the Nazis had first taken over, Etta had been this strong, very energetic girl with dreams of becoming a professional ballet dancer. She'd been so young when the occupation began that she hadn't fully understood what was even happening. But then, Etta's uncle, who was a prominent anti-Nazi activist, had been captured and executed by the Nazis. And this really spurred Etta into action. She saw how serious this really was, and she was not just going to stand idly by. And so she had spent several years working with an anti-Nazi group called the Dutch Resistance, doing things like, performing ballet at secret fundraising events to try to raise money for this anti-Nazi movement, and also smuggling resistance newspapers all over the country. She'd even convinced her family to take in refugees and hide them from the Nazis, even though she knew that if she and her family were caught, they would all be killed. And all of this had given Etta a real sense of purpose. She felt like she was actually doing something tangible to fight the Nazis. However, about 9 months earlier, the Nazis had cut off supply lines into the Netherlands, and since then, the entire country had been completely devastated. People had basically no food, they had zero access to medicine, running water, or electricity, and so Etta, like many other people in this country, had begun to starve. And she'd gotten so sick and so weak that as she was starving, she couldn't do any work with the resistance at all anymore. All she could do was literally just lie in this basement and effectively wait to die. And that particular day, as she listened to the sound of planes, gunshots, and sirens going off outside, Etta prayed to God for help. But the only response she got was a high-pitched whistling sound, then a deafening blast. The floor shook, glass shattered, and everything went black. Sometime later, we don't know exactly how long, probably days, Etta came to. And unbelievably, as she looked around, despite effectively her basement being the target of a bombing run, she looked around and saw the basement's structural integrity had effectively held up, and her loved ones and the refugees and she were all still alive. But, Etta, she was not like, oh great, everything's fine now. It was more like, okay, the Nazis are getting closer. And if they've bombed us just now, I'm bound to be bombed again, or I'm gonna starve to death, like the end is right on top of us. But as she kind of looked around and continued to take stock of the situation, she realized something was very different. Over the last several weeks and months, the constant bombardment of bombs and guns and sirens and chaos outside was near constant. But right now, even though they've just recently been bombed and barely survived, like the Nazis must be right on top of us, despite that, she's listening and she can't hear anything outside. There's no explosions, no gunfire, nothing. It's quiet. Etta and her family were much more confused than anything else. But eventually, they worked up the courage and, with the help of her mother literally carrying Etta, the group of them, along with the refugees, walked out of the basement to see what was going on outside. And when they got up there, what they found were the streets were full of Allied soldiers. And they saw Dutch people crying and hugging, saying it was all over. And that's when Etta, her family, and the remaining refugees that were with them realized the Allied soldiers had liberated their city. For the first time in nearly 5 years, they were now free from Nazi occupation. If that bomb had struck more directly on their basement, or if the war had simply gone on for even just one more day, Etta could have very easily died in that basement. Instead, she survived. Sort of against all odds, she survived. Shortly after coming out of the basement, the Allied powers didn't just liberate that city where Etta lived. They fully eradicated the Nazis across Europe. The Allies won, and World War II finally ended. And Etta, who basically shouldn't be alive at this point, went on to have this unbelievable post-war life. Before the war, Etta had dreamed of becoming a professional ballet dancer. But during the war, she had suffered all these injuries and really had been affected by malnutrition, and it left her with long-term health problems that effectively made dancing full-time not a possibility. So instead, she began modeling and acting, and eventually she moved to Hollywood. And in 1953, so 8 years after nearly being blown up by the Nazis and starved to death by the Nazis, Etta starred in a movie called Roman Holiday. And she actually won an Academy Award for her performance, even though World War II had taken a lot from Etta and her family. I mean, it had nearly killed her, and it also took away her dream of being a ballet dancer. Despite that, experiencing the war so intimately like she had been forced to, it had instilled this incredible poise and discipline and a real quiet strength in her that would make her one of the most successful actresses of all time. Etta was actually just her nickname. And when she started making it big in Hollywood, she abandoned it and began going by her full name, Audrey Hepburn. One morning in the summer of 1889, a 36-year-old surgeon named William Halstead and his head nurse, 27-year-old Caroline Hampton, stood in an operating room prep area in the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Halstead was the surgeon-in-chief of this hospital, and that morning, he and Caroline were getting ready for a surgery. Now, Dr. Halstead had already washed up and was prepped, and now he was watching Caroline very closely to make sure she followed his hygiene requirements exactly. Caroline stood in front of a row of sinks that were all filled with different cleaning agents. She started by washing her hands with scalding hot water and medical-grade antibacterial soap. Then she cleaned her nails with brushes and files. Then she dipped her hands in acid. And then she finally finished with a 5-minute soak in a highly corrosive liquid called mercury bichloride. Dr. Halstead ran a really tight ship, specifically when it came to hand washing. And this was the process he believed was the safest. And Dr. Halstead's theory that basically nuking your hands with cleaning agents before doing anything in the medical field actually made him sort of unique at the time. Because this was 1889. And hand washing was just not very common, not even in hospitals. Germ theory, which is the idea that illnesses can spread by germs that we can't see, and they're all over us, on our hands in particular, and so we have to kill the germs to prevent the spread of illness, right? That theory, germ theory, was very new at the time. And truthfully, a lot of doctors at the time didn't believe in germ theory, which meant they didn't do things which we would now consider standard hygiene practice in hospitals, like, basic hand washing and regularly disinfecting tools and surfaces. And Dr. Halstead was a huge proponent of germ theory and aggressive hand washing. And so he had instituted this whole multi-step awful hand washing routine for his whole surgical team at Johns Hopkins. And the results had actually been fantastic. He had one of the lowest surgical mortality rates in the whole country. But despite that, people still sort of thought Dr. Halstead was crazy, including his own staff who, complained about these highly corrosive cleaning materials that they were rubbing all over their hands all the time. Like even if this worked, like this was kind of awful. But despite that, Dr. Halstead was not about to change his protocol. He knew it worked, even if it hurt. But that particular day, as Dr. Halstead and Caroline sat there letting their hands air dry after dipping them repeatedly in acid, he couldn't help but notice when he looked over at Caroline that her hands and her forearms looked really bad. Like they were blistered and just totally damaged from clearly doing this process all the time. And Dr. Halstead, he just sort of felt bad about it. And the reason he felt bad about it was sort of twofold. One, Caroline never complained, even though obviously every day when she would do this procedure that he is forcing on her, she was hurting herself in the process, but she never complained. And so that's actually why he had elevated her to head nurse, because he thought she had such grit and determination and she believed in the process, and so he had made her head nurse. But the other and more prominent reason why Dr. Halstead felt sort of bad about Caroline in particular and the condition of her hands and forearms was because Dr. Halstead was secretly totally infatuated with Caroline. Now, he had never told her that. This was something he kept completely inside because he, one, thought he was too old for her, and two, he just kind of assumed that she would never be interested in him. So he just carried this intense love of Caroline and was very protective of Caroline, but she didn't really know. And so that was why when he looked over and saw her clearly in pain but not complaining, that because of his love for her, Dr. Halstead really, for the first time, began to question his big hygiene process. He knew it worked, but at what cost? His beloved Caroline was suffering because of him. And worse, he was sort of trapped. He would love to tell her that she didn't have to do that. Let your skin heal. I'm so sorry, Caroline. But if he did that, if he made an exception for her and said, don't follow this process anymore, people would find out, and it would totally undermine his credibility. His whole thing is he's like, everyone must follow this process to stop the spread of germs and stop the spread of illnesses. Everybody's got to do this. And so if he didn't make her, what does that say about him? And so as he's sitting there watching Caroline dutifully get ready for surgery, Dr. Halstead, for the first time, really began seriously considering if there was any way, any sort of workaround that maybe could lessen the pain for Caroline, just because he loved her. That was it. It wasn't a safety thing. It was just because he loved Caroline. But despite putting some real thought and energy into trying to come up with something to lessen the burden on Caroline, he just couldn't find a solution. All his solutions involved her not following the process, which he couldn't do. Fast forward to early 1890. So about a year after Dr. Halstead first really began considering how can he help Caroline not hurt her hands anymore. So about a year after that began to be a thing for him, and he's in his office and he's looking at his desk, and on his desk is this small package. And he hasn't opened it yet, but he's so excited. He's also kind of nervous, but he feels like this is it. This is the thing I've been waiting for. So over the past year, Dr. Halstead had continued to iterate on how can I help Caroline? How can I keep her from hurting herself? And eventually he had this huge epiphany. He came up with this sort of outside the box concept and he pitched it to a company and said, hey, can you help me make these? And now sitting in front of him on the desk was effectively the prototype of this strange thing he had come up with, which again was just to help his love, Caroline. And so Dr. Halstead took a deep breath, he walked over and he ripped open the package, and inside were these two strange looking objects. And he picked them up, and without any hesitation, Dr. Halstead took the two objects, he left his office, hustled down the hallway to the OR prep room where he finds Caroline. And she's getting ready to wash her hands, for an upcoming surgery. And he stops her and says, here, and he hands her the two objects. And he says, don't wash your hands, just use these. And with a confused look, with her bloody and blistered hands, she took the two objects and said, okay. 1 week later, and already Caroline's hands and forearms were healing up beautifully. And also, Dr. Halstead, over the course of this week, was so excited about his prototype and the progress that he was clearly seeing in Caroline's skin condition that he finally worked up the nerve to tell Caroline how much he loved her. And Caroline would actually tell him that, believe it or not, I'm in love with you too. And before long, Dr. Halstead proposed to Caroline and they got married. However, it was not their love that sort of was remembered for generations to come. Instead, the only reason we know about these two is because of that prototype that Dr. Halstead came up with, what he gave to Caroline that ultimately saved her skin. It was the perfect workaround to his hygiene hand-washing process. In fact, these objects that he created were so effective that he and everybody else basically in medicine across the world began to use these brand new tools. And so it is almost entirely because of one man's love for a woman that we now have arguably the most used medical tool in the world. Dr. Halstead inadvertently created the world's first ever rubber surgical gloves. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Hey guys, today we have a really special video for you. So if you haven't already heard, we just released our second graphic novel, Where Nightmares Live, and it's available wherever books or audiobooks are sold. And what better way to get you guys a little sneak peek of this incredible piece of art than to tell you one of the new stories that is in this book. Again, our second graphic novel, Where Nightmares Live, is out right now wherever books are sold, so grab your copy today and follow along. And remember, your nightmares are waiting. Today's story is a good old-fashioned ghost story. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button has a big international flight planned, offer to buy them some snacks for the ride. But don't tell them your snacks are made entirely of Olestra, and they're laced with laxatives. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of January 3rd, 1804, a 22-year-old man named Thomas Millwood sat inside of a local pub in Hammersmith, England, feeling totally annoyed. Now, normally, Thomas was a very upbeat and social person. He worked as a bricklayer, and basically every day after work, he would meet up with his friends at this pub. They would have some drinks and share stories and laugh. It would be a great time. But tonight, it was like everything annoyed Thomas, especially his friends. And as his friends droned on and on about the current drama going on in their town, Thomas finally had just had enough, and before he could stop himself, he stood up and slammed his beer mug down on the table, and right away Thomas knew he had overdone it, because immediately the pub went deadly silent, his friends all stopped, everybody's looking over at Thomas, and Thomas kind of muttered an apology, and then quickly grabbed his coat, he stood up, and just began walking like he was going to leave the pub. And the pub, again, is totally silent as he's walking, and then right as he's about to go out the door, his friends broke the tense silence in the pub, and they called out to him and said, "Hey, be careful out there." And Thomas just looked at his friends and kind of rolled his eyes and said, "Yeah, okay." And then he went outside. Thomas decided he would walk to his parents' house, which was not far away, and he would just sit by the fire and warm up for a bit before he had to go back out later that night to meet up with his wife. His wife worked long hours and she often worked late, and when she worked late, Thomas would meet her at work and escort her back home. And that's what he was doing tonight. And so Thomas began walking down Black Lion Lane, and per usual, Thomas was basically one of the only people outside. Hammersmith used to be this very friendly and bustling place. It was home to 45,000 people. It was located right on the outskirts of London, and lots of rich people like to go there to vacation. But recently, there had been a string of all these increasingly bizarre sightings, or attacks as people were calling them, in Hammersmith, and it had all the residents completely on edge to the point where people were not going outside. Now, Thomas thought it was totally ridiculous and thought people were completely overreacting, and so he had been doing his his best to ignore the drama going on in town, but it was getting harder and harder to do that. As Thomas rounded a corner, he nearly walked into two men that were walking the other direction. And when Thomas looked up to say he was sorry, one of the men screamed, "Get back!" And he was holding a club in his hand, and the other guy had a pistol in his waist, and he had his hand on the pistol grip. Thomas instinctively threw his hands up to show he was not a threat, at which point the man lowered his club, and the other guy took his hand off his pistol, and one of them said to Thomas, "Hey, it's dangerous to be out here alone. You should not be out here by yourself." And then before Thomas could say anything to them, they quickly walked past him and disappeared around the corner. By now, Thomas was only a few houses away from his parents' house, and so he just kind of brushed off the incident and sped walked his way to his parents' house, kind of cursing the two men under his breath for their ridiculous warning about how dangerous it was out here. A minute later, Thomas arrived at his parents' house, and he walked up to the door, and normally his parents would keep the door unlocked. But when he tried it, it was locked, and then a second later, he heard his sister, Anne, inside the house coming to the door, and she called out through the door, "Who's there?" And Thomas is like, "It's me, Anne." But apparently that was not enough, and Anne called through the door, "Well, I don't know if it's really you, so back up so I can see you through the peephole." Thomas rolled his eyes, but he did what his sister asked. He stepped back and allowed her to see his whole person through the peephole, at which point he heard Anne fumbling with the lock. The door was unlocked. She opened it up. Thomas stepped inside, and his sister immediately shut and locked the door behind him. And her first question to Thomas was, "Well, did you see it?" Thomas immediately wished he had not come to his parents' house to avoid talking about this stupid topic, but he realized that if he had gone back to his house, he likely would have gotten the same question from his mother-in-law, who lived with him and his wife. Because actually, it didn't really seem to matter where you went in Hammersmith or who you talked to, because the conversation was always going to be the same. It was going to be about these attacks, because the people of Hammersmith were absolutely convinced these attacks were being committed by a ghost. It all started about 2 months earlier when somebody spotted this mysterious figure lurking in the church cemetery. And Thomas thought really the hysteria should have stopped right then and there, because only a couple of days after the sighting, it was figured out that the figure was actually just the butcher's son, and he was just dressing up in women's clothes, walking around in the cemetery to scare his friends. It was a prank. That was it. But the hysteria in town did not go away, because a week after this first weird sighting, there was another sighting in the cemetery. A local chimney sweep said he saw someone walking around in the cemetery who disappeared into the ground. Now, admittedly, a lot of people in Hammersmith, when they heard about this second sighting, they did kind of brush it off as just hysteria. But it was after this second sighting that the so-called attacks began in town. Late one night, a local resident was walking past the cemetery when something came up behind them and began choking them, and this resident was able to break free and run away to safety, but they turned and got a look at whatever was attacking them, and they described it as a phantom. Shortly after that, a local carriage driver was going past the cemetery when they got out for some reason, and then this creature with horns on its head came charging out and confronted the carriage driver, who apparently just turned and ran away, abandoning his 8 horses and 16 passengers. And so by late December, there had been so many more of these strange attacks and weird sightings in town that basically everybody in Hammersmith, save for basically Thomas, was totally gripped by fear. And as terror kind of spread across town, Thomas had attempted to convince his wife and mother-in-law and his family that there was just no way this was a real ghost. This is people's paranoia and their imaginations running wild. That's all this is. But Thomas's theory was really put into question when just a few days earlier, so a few days before he stormed out of the pub because he was so annoyed, somebody had died following one of these attacks. A pregnant woman had died. The woman had been walking alone near the church cemetery at about 10 p.m. at night when something in the cemetery had rose up out of the ground, rushed over to her, and grabbed onto her, and she barely had time to kind of turn and look, and she saw this kind of white flowing robe and a long pointed white hat, and that was all she remembered, because then she passed out. Then she woke up again and she was in somebody's house and her neighbors were all around her. They had found her passed out in the cemetery and carried her there. And so she comes to, and she's only able to choke out the story of what happened to her, the ghost attack, before she died. And so following this pregnant woman's death, the town of Hammersmith offered a reward for anybody who could capture or kill the ghost, which was now being dubbed the Hammersmith Ghost. The night watchmen began doing extra patrols. In fact, those two men that Thomas had turned the corner and bumped into, one guy had the club, the other guy had a gun, those guys were on their own patrol. And so the ghost and how to capture or kill it was basically the only thing people in Hammersmith wanted to talk about, and it totally annoyed Thomas. It was what was being talked about at the pub by his friends when he got so mad he slammed the cup down and left the pub. To Thomas, the idea of capturing or killing a ghost made no sense because a ghost is not real. Now, by this point, the butcher's son had come out and said, look, I didn't do any of these other attacks. That's not me. I only did the first one. And he had an alibi to prove it. But to Thomas, this didn't rule out that the ghost was not a person. To Thomas, he just felt like, okay, then there's somebody else in town that's just copying the butcher's son's prank, except obviously they've taken the pranks too far because they've gotten someone killed. At about 10 p.m., Thomas was inside of his parents' house, sitting by the fire, just kind of beginning to doze off. And as he sat there, he thought to himself how little he wanted to go out into the freezing cold night to go walk with his wife all the way back home. He'd much rather just stay here and sleep for the night and let his wife walk home on her own. But when he floated this idea to his sister Anne, who was standing nearby, she exploded on him and was like, are you kidding me? You're going to let your wife walk home alone in this environment? She's going to be the next victim of the Hammersmith ghost. Get out there and protect your wife. Thomas was like, okay. And he got up, he grabbed his jacket, and he walked outside. As soon as Thomas was outside, he was feeling so annoyed at the current situation that he found himself thinking, you know what? If I run into that stupid Hammersmith ghost, the person disguised as a ghost, I'm gonna bum rush them and beat them up. And it will prove to the entire town that there was never any ghost. It was just a person the whole time. And so Thomas began walking briskly down the road. He turned onto Black Lion Lane, and immediately he saw this big bush off to the side of the road on the sidewalk, and he could have sworn behind this bush there was something or someone crouched down, like they were trying to hide. And so Thomas stopped and he squinted in the direction of this bush, and then at some point he saw movement enough to confirm to him that that must be a person back there, and suddenly it clicked for Thomas. That must be the person pretending to be this ghost. That's the prankster / murderer. There they are. And so without any hesitation, Thomas balled up his fists and just started sprinting towards this person. At virtually the exact same time, Anne, Thomas's sister, was still in their parents' house, and she was looking out the window kind of roughly in the direction that Thomas had gone, and she heard this loud scream that sounded like a man. Now, she couldn't see her brother, but she's thinking, oh my God, it's coming roughly from the area where he went. What if he's getting attacked by the ghost? And so she bolted outside. Just a couple of minutes after that, a big posse of men came tumbling out of that pub where Thomas had been drinking earlier that night and got really mad and slammed his cup down. So they come stumbling out of the pub, and they were being led not by the night watchman who was amongst the posse, but instead they were being led by the town's tax collector, a man named Francis Smith, who looked totally disheveled and out of breath and did not look like the type of guy who would be leading a big posse. But here we were. He was leading this posse, and he took them down the road, and they turned the corner onto Black Lion Lane, and as soon as they looked down that same road that Thomas had been on and then seen the person in the bush, the posse, they stopped because they saw a body in the middle of the road, and it didn't appear to be moving. And then crouched over the body was this dark figure that was kind of hunched over this body. And the figure turned and it looked at the posse and let out this unbelievable scream. And the posse just kind of backed up and didn't know what to do. But then the night watchman broke ranks and just began sprinting at the creature that was perched over the body. And the watchman tackled the creature onto the ground and kind of pinned it there. At the same time, the rest of the posse, seeing an opening, rushed over to the body in the road to see if maybe they were alive and if maybe they could help this person. But unfortunately, when they got to the body, they could tell this person was dead. The posse believed they had just discovered the latest victim of the Hammersmith ghost and the Hammersmith ghost themselves, the black creature that the watchman tackled onto the ground. But they were wrong. When Thomas had rounded the corner onto Black Lion Lane and he looked into that bush and he saw that figure moving around, it really was a person. It was not a ghost, it was a human being.
It was Francis Smith, the town's tax collector, and he was hiding behind the bush. However, Francis was not hiding behind the bush because he was pretending to be the Hammersmith ghost, like Thomas was assuming, which is why he ran after him. Instead, Francis was hiding behind that bush because he was basically laying in wait for the Hammersmith ghost. He was hoping the ghost would walk past him and he could run out and capture or kill this thing and get the reward. Basically, Francis was doing the same thing Thomas was doing. The only difference was Francis actually believed in the ghost and Thomas did not. And it was just Thomas's bad luck that that night he had chosen to wear his all-white work clothes, which to Francis, who's hiding in the bush, terrified and waiting for the ghost, he sees Thomas in these white clothes and he was absolutely convinced he was the Hammersmith ghost. And so when the two men spotted each other, they both attacked, except Francis had a rifle. And so when Thomas ran up to him to basically punch him in the face, Francis just raised his gun and fired. And the bullet hit Thomas directly in the face, which killed him instantly. But after shooting and killing Thomas, Francis had no idea that it was a real person. He was so jacked up on adrenaline that he did think he shot the ghost, but didn't know if the ghost was actually dead or not, and he didn't want to be alone when he checked, so he just turned and ran to the pub, gathered up the posse, and said, "Hey, I got the ghost, come on!" And they all ran back to Black Lion Lane, and when they got there, Thomas's sister, Anne, who heard that scream, she had made it to her brother's body, and she was the creature crouched over him, screaming out of grief. That's all she was doing. She had just found her dead brother and was reacting to it when the watchman tackled her to the ground. But luckily, the posse quickly realized this is not a ghost, this is Thomas and his sister, and so his sister was not harmed. And so, on January 11th, 1804, Francis Smith was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. But 5 weeks later, the King of England would pardon Francis and shorten his sentence to just 1 year. The Hammersmith ghost incident was debated for more than 150 years, and ultimately it led to a modern-day ruling that says a person is allowed to use self-defense if they truly and reasonably believe they're in danger, even if they are wrong about the danger they face. The true identity of the Hammersmith ghost, not the very first one, which we know was the butcher's son, but all the other instances, all the other attacks, well, it would turn out it was the town's shoemaker who would confess to his crime following Thomas's murder. He would tell people that the only reason he did it was to get revenge on his apprentices who had really badly scared his children by telling them ghost stories.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you 3 very spooky stories that, depending on your interpretation, you could view all 3 of these as ghost stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to house sit for the like button. But as soon as you get there, just take all their belongings and put them out on the curb with a big sign that just says free right next to them, and then just leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in the summer of 1876, a doctor named Lewis Allard walked down the hallway of a hospital in Papeete, Tahiti. Tahiti is an island east of Australia. Lewis was just about to step into his office when he heard the hospital doors open, and he looked over to see a few policemen walking in, carrying this unconscious man on a stretcher. Just from the looks of the way this guy was dressed, Dr. Allard could tell he was a sailor. So a lot of Dr. Allard's patients were sailors because Papeete was a port town. So if people got sick or injured at sea and then docked in Papeete, they would come to the hospital right there. So Dr. Allard walked over to the police and asked them what was going on with the sailor. And the officers explained that this man's friends had found him unresponsive that morning, apparently after a very long night of drinking. Dr. Allard nodded and then motioned for the police to follow him and bring this guy with him, and he led them over to an exam room, where he had them lay out the sailor on a table so that Dr. Allard could look him over. The sailor appeared to be pretty young. He was in his 20s maybe, and he appeared very healthy and strong. But when the doctor checked for a pulse, there was none. And so after checking a couple more times to make sure it wasn't just a very weak pulse, the doctor ultimately concluded that, this sailor was not just unresponsive. The sailor was dead, and if Dr. Allard had to guess, he very likely died from alcohol poisoning, given his friends said, the night before, this guy had had a really heavy night of drinking, and here he was, so alcohol poisoning. So this hospital had a policy for how to handle the death of foreign sailors in Tahiti. Basically, the doctor who pronounced the sailor dead would then arrange for them to be buried in a public cemetery. And in fact, the hospital kept these cheap wooden coffins in the hospital morgue for this exact purpose. And so Dr. Allard followed protocol and asked the police to go inform the sailor's friends of his death, and then the doctor went to the hospital's morgue to arrange for a coffin. A few hours later, Dr. Allard was back in his office when he heard a knock at his door. He told whoever it was to come in, but when the door swung open, the doctor was surprised at who he saw there. It was the 4 local gravediggers who he had called earlier to bury that sailor who had just died. Now, generally speaking, Dr. Allard had virtually no interactions with the gravediggers after he hired them. He would tell them to bury the body, and they would do that and go on their separate way. Like there was no reason for the gravediggers to come back and check in with the doctor. But as the doctor is looking at these 4 guys trying to figure out what was going on here, he quickly assessed that, these guys weren't here just to chat. They were here because they looked spooked. And before Dr. Allard could ask any questions about, what was going on here, one of these gravediggers began to speak. And in sort of a rapid and sort of anxious tone, he said, as we were carrying the coffin over to the gravesite, it began to shake like the person inside the coffin was alive. And then we heard all these moaning sounds coming from inside of this nailed shut coffin. And we all got so panicked that we just dropped the coffin and we ran here to tell you. Now, Dr. Allard was pretty surprised by what he was hearing, but he's also thinking that, when he hired these 4 gravediggers, they were at a local pub and they were drinking. And so he's thinking to himself, maybe something strange happened, with this coffin, or much more likely, these 4 guys are drunk, and that what they've sort of said here is just some figment of their imagination, that they're not professional, they're just drunk guys who are coming here screwing up my day. And so sort of annoyed, Dr. Allard's like, hey, I'm telling you, that guy is dead, okay? This isn't a ghost scenario, but if you're so worried about it, why don't you go get a police officer, have them come over and inspect the coffin, make sure the person is really dead in there, and then once they confirm that, please do your job and bury this guy. And so the gravediggers, they kind of, look down sort of awkwardly and they're like, okay, we'll go do that. Then they turned and they left. And then Dr. Allard got back to work. And then a few hours later, Dr. Allard heard another knock on his door. And this time when the door opened, it was a police officer. And it was actually the officer that the 4 gravediggers had gone and found at Dr. Allard's suggestion. And he had gone over, checked the coffin, and the coffin wasn't moving, it wasn't making any weird sounds, it was sealed shut, there was nothing going on. And so the officer eventually instructed the gravediggers, to go ahead and bury it, there's nothing going on here. And so the gravediggers had, at that point, buried the coffin, and that had been that. And so the officer was here just to tell Dr. Allard that, hey, it's all good, he's buried, we can move on. About a week later, Dr. Allard had basically forgotten about this whole snafu around the coffin and whatever was going on with it. He was sort of on to the next thing, and he was out like he normally was at night to go for a walk. And the area that he liked to walk in the most was actually the cemetery. Not because he had some sort of morbid obsession, but because, it was often, vacant. There was nobody there. And so it was a peaceful place to go walking. And so, he's strolling through the cemetery like usual, and he's not seeing anybody like usual. But as it began to get dark, he was walking down this one row of headstones, and he looked up ahead, and he could have sworn he saw somebody standing behind a tree with their body sort of half out of the tree, half behind the tree, sort of half obscured. And he stopped and he's looking, and the whole thing just sort of felt off. Like, what is this person doing? Is that a person? Like, what's going on here? And so he's staring, and as he's looking, sure enough, this dark silhouette steps out from behind this tree. And the way they stepped out, it was like they stepped out, turned, and faced Dr. Allard, and just stood there, clearly looking right at Dr. Allard. But they're pretty far away from Dr. Allard, like there's a good distance between them. But immediately, Dr. Allard felt threatened by this person, or whatever it was. He didn't even know if it was a person. He couldn't tell if it was his mind playing tricks on him or not. He's just staring at this thing that looked like it was looking at him. And so Dr. Allard instinctively, who's now feeling a little bit frightened, turned and just started walking away, like he was done walking in the cemetery for the night. And so he turns and he starts walking, but then it's like the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He just felt like this person, whoever it is, they're still watching me. And so he stopped after just a couple of steps and he turned back around. And now this figure is clearly marching directly towards Dr. Allard. They're almost running. They're walking real fast right towards Dr. Allard. And so now Dr. Allard's terrified. He knows there's something happening here. Why would this person be doing this? Like, is it a person? Like, what's happening here? And so Dr. Allard, he turns and starts to run. And as he's running, he hears this horrible high-pitched scream echo across the entire cemetery. And then he looks back one last time and he sees the face of this figure, this person charging towards him. And it's the same guy who died a week ago, the same sailor that he buried, the one who presumably was moving around in the coffin the gravediggers were so scared of. It was him. And he jumped on Dr. Allard and began throttling him. And Dr. Allard's on the ground staring at this ghastly face. This scream is coming out of him. He had no idea what was going on. And then Dr. Allard just blacked out. A few minutes later, Dr. Allard came to and he sat up suddenly and he's looking around and there's nobody there. It's just a dark, vacant cemetery. No sign of the dead sailor's ghost or whatever, or whoever it was. They're gone. And Dr. Allard's just sitting there, his heart's racing still, and he's telling himself, like, did that even just happen? Like, it felt so real. His neck was sore from, what he felt was this guy, this thing attacking him. But at the same time, he was so sure that the face that he had seen on this person was the dead sailor's face. But how could that be? He's dead. He's buried. How could that be? And so ultimately, Dr. Allard, he got up and he hustled back to his house. But over the coming weeks, Dr. Allard sort of spiraled into madness. Because it was like every day, all the time, he would see out of the corner of his eye for a second, like a glimpse of this dead sailor's ghost. And it was always that face, that ghastly face, that shrieking face looking right at him. And he'd turn and, the face would disappear. But Dr. Allard, he just felt like he was almost being haunted, that something had happened, like that attack in the cemetery. It had felt so real. He felt like now this ghost was literally haunting him. But he couldn't tell anyone. I mean, he's a doctor. What's he gonna do? Tell people that a ghost is haunting him? He didn't know what to do. And so what he ended up doing after several weeks is he just began staying home and laying in bed, basically feigning illness to avoid leaving the house. And he would just lay there with his eyes closed basically all day, because as soon as he opened his eyes, he would see this dead sailor's face. He really was losing his mind. And then eventually, when Dr. Allard knew he had to stop basically staying in bed all day and go back to the hospital and sort of function in society again, go back to work, otherwise people were gonna start asking questions here, like, what's going on with you? And he didn't have an answer, When that time came and he knew it was sort of like, okay, go back to normal or tell people about this. Well, what Dr. Allard ultimately did is he decided to walk up to the roof of his house and throw himself off. He literally couldn't live with what he believed was this ghost haunting him 24/7. When the doctor's close friends found out that the doctor had taken his own life, they immediately went to the police and said, hey, wait a minute, we think this has something to do with what he was dealing with over the past several weeks. So the doctor, despite not wanting to tell anybody about, his haunting, he did sort of begin to tell a couple of his close friends. Now, he was sort of subtle about it, but he began telling people that he's like, yeah, I keep seeing that dead sailor's face everywhere I go. I just keep seeing him. Now, he didn't highlight the fact that he was basically losing his mind over it and thought it was literally a ghost. But a couple of his close friends were aware that it almost seemed like, Dr. Allard was effectively having a mental breakdown over this dead sailor. And they did sort of connect that Dr. Allard sort of felt haunted by this dead sailor. And so, said close friends ultimately went to the police and said, hey, I know this is a stretch, but the doctor kind of thought he was being haunted by this dead sailor before he died. We think that has to do with why he took his own life. And sort of amazingly, the police, the way they responded to this was, okay, we're going to look into this. We're going to investigate the haunting, so to speak. And what they did is they exhumed the coffin of that dead sailor. They didn't know what else to do. They just decided they would do that. And so they raised the coffin out of the ground and they open it up and they cannot believe what they see. So it would turn out those 4 gravediggers had been totally justified in being scared about what they thought they heard and felt in that coffin when they were going to bury it. Because the sailor was not dead. He was just so drunk that it felt like he was dead. They couldn't feel his pulse. Dr. Allard had been wrong. The sailor was not dead. He was totally alive. And so as he was being carried over to the gravesite to be buried, he really was moving around inside the coffin and moaning because he was horribly hungover, but totally alive and, grappling with the fact that he's now, confined inside of this coffin. He likely had no idea what was going on, so you can imagine the types of sounds and things he might be doing. And so the gravediggers, they were right to be scared. They did get a police officer. The police officer came over, and for whatever reason, when he inspected the coffin, he saw it was sealed. There was no movement inside the coffin. It was totally quiet. So, the sailor inside, he just wasn't moving or making any sound. And so the police officer greenlit burying him. So the living sailor inside the coffin is buried underground by these gravediggers, and they go their separate ways afterwards. But then that sailor wakes up again. He begins thrashing around after being buried in the ground. And he actually managed to break out of the coffin and climb out of the ground. He saved himself. He literally, survived being buried alive. But he was furious at the doctor, who so cavalierly just decided he was dead and now go bury him. And so he decided he would play a prank on the doctor to get back at him. So what he did is he filled his coffin up with rocks and he sealed it back up and he reburied it so nobody would know anything. And then for the next week or so, he just kind of hid out and didn't let anybody know that he was actually still alive. And then, after about a week, he knew the doctor took his walks in that cemetery, and so he hid behind a tree in the cemetery and waited for the doctor to be alone making his walk. And when he saw him, it was the sailor, fully alive in the flesh, stepping out from behind the tree, looking at the doctor. That was him. It really was the sailor. And he really did run forward, shrieking, pretending to be a ghost. And he attacked Dr. Allard, basically giving him the impression that his angry ghost was attacking him. And then after Dr. Allard passed out on the ground, the sailor ran off. But for Dr. Allard, who fully believed that sailor was dead, can you imagine what he thought when he saw, the sailor attacking him and shrieking in the middle of the cemetery? He fully believed that was the sailor's ghost, and he had this totally real experience getting attacked by the ghost. And so even though he survived the encounter, it drove him mad. He began seeing the dead sailor, the ghost, everywhere he went, and it eventually drove him to kill himself. And so when the police opened up that coffin, all they saw were all the rocks the sailor had left behind. But following the doctor's suicide, that sailor apparently skipped town and was never seen again. It begins here. From the director of It comes It, Welcome to Derry, the chilling new HBO original series exploring one of horror's biggest terrors, Pennywise the Clown. Set in 1960s Derry, Maine, the new HBO original series premieres Sunday, October 26th on HBO Max. Also, you can listen to the official It, Welcome to Derry podcast wherever you get your podcasts. On the night of August 30th, 1892, a 20-year-old man named Benjamin Trudell climbed into his bed inside of the Deer Park Life-Saving Station, which was a small government building right off the coast of Lake Superior in Michigan. Benjamin was a member of the Life-Saving Service, which was a precursor to the US Coast Guard, and he was currently working overnight as a surfman, which was basically like a lifeguard, but specifically for ships that were out on the lake. He was there with a bunch of other surfmen who were all taking shifts, either sleeping, patrolling the beach, or staying awake inside the station in case somebody came looking for help. Benjamin had just finished a 4-hour beach patrol, which had been pretty uneventful, but at the same time, he was still walking around for 4 hours on loose sand, and so he was pretty tired. And so now that he was back at the station, he had a little bit of time where he could basically take a nap. And so he set his alarm for 4 hours later, which is when he would need to be awake in the station to take on another shift. And then he told his fellow surfmen that he was gonna close his eyes for a minute. And then he climbed into bed and fell asleep. A few hours later, though, Ben shot up in bed and began frantically looking around the room. He was covered in sweat, his heart was racing, and after a second, he realized that, he's okay. He's in the station, he's safe, and what had just happened to him was just a dream. He had a terrifying nightmare, but it had felt so real that it really took him a second to, understand that that's all it had been, just a dream. In this dream, Benjamin was walking along the coast of Lake Superior, like he did during his nightly beach patrol, and it was dark out and there was this awful thunderstorm, and the rain was coming down so hard that Benjamin could barely see, and in fact he almost felt like the impacts of the individual raindrops almost hurt his skin, like they were acid striking his skin. Then suddenly, through this wall of rain right in front of him, this man who Ben didn't recognize kind of stumbled into view. And this man was wearing very nice clothing, like he was on his way to a party or something. But, they're down at the coast of this lake and it's storming out, like it didn't make any sense. But Benjamin, he just stared at this guy and didn't say anything. And the guy looked right back at Benjamin, and without saying a word, he just reached out and really aggressively shook Benjamin's hand. And then, as Benjamin is watching his hand be shaken around by this guy with wild eyes turns and he points out to the lake that's right next to them. And even though he didn't say anything, he pointed with this level of urgency, like there's something out there, something bad, and you need to pay attention to whatever it is. And so Benjamin, he turned, and his hand's still being shaken by this guy, and he looks out, but it's just a wall of water. He can't even see the lake, and he has no idea what this guy is trying to tell him. And it was at that point that, Benjamin sat up and he was awake again. Now, objectively, Benjamin understood that while this dream definitely was creepy, it wasn't really terrifying. It was raining and storming and a random guy came up and shook his hand and pointed at the lake. That's not terrifying. But for some reason for Benjamin, it just felt so real that was the thing that made it so unsettling. It felt like he really had been out there and really had this interaction. Now, Benjamin was not the type of guy that would, find meaning in dreams. He basically chalked dreams up as just that, just dreams. But there was something different about this dream. He felt almost intuitively like what had just happened in his dream was a warning. That man, whoever he was telling Benjamin something, and it had to do with the lake, but he didn't know what it was. But as Benjamin thought about this, he knew how sort of crazy that sounded. And he figured that maybe he was just kind of caught up in the immediacy of having just had this dream, that really the only reason he felt like it had weight is because it just happened. And so maybe if he just went outside and got some fresh air and let some time pass, that he would, let this dream fade into the ether and he'd go back to normal life. And sure enough, when he got outside and got some fresh air, he did feel better. But he did still feel like that dream meant something. And so he just walked down to the coast of Lake Superior, where he was in his dream, to the other surfmen who were down there doing their own patrol. And there, there was nothing unusual happening. The lake, it was so calm. And Benjamin, he went up to one of the surfmen and just kind of told them about this dream. And he was almost joking about it. He's like, yeah, it felt so real that I almost feel like it was a warning of some kind. But yeah, it's just a dream. And the other surfmen who were listening just were like, yeah, that's crazy dream, huh? And that was it. The following day, around noon, Benjamin and his fellow surfmen were hanging out inside the life-saving station when all of a sudden, this guy comes stumbling into the station and he looked awful. He was soaking wet, he was covered in all these cuts and bruises, and he was visibly shaking so much that it almost looked like he was about to collapse right there onto the floor. Benjamin immediately asked the guy, hey, what's going on? What's brought you here? What's happening? And the man, who clearly was struggling to just breathe at this point, sort of composed himself and just said, I was out on the lake last night on a ship that sunk. And as soon as he said that, Benjamin was in total disbelief. Because if a ship sunk on Lake Superior, the life-saving service that Benjamin was a part of was supposed to know, because they patrolled the lake and tracked the vessels out on the water. So it seems sort of impossible that a ship could sink and his crew, the surfmen, would somehow not even know about it. And then, at the same time Benjamin is thinking this, he couldn't help but go back to that dream he had had. It had happened last night, and it just seemed like this guy was warning Benjamin about something out on the lake. It just seemed way too coincidental that this guy's here the next day talking about a shipwreck out on the lake around the same time frame. The survivor of this shipwreck explained that the ship had been really far out on the lake, probably too far away from shore for them to even see. And he said that he and several other people had made it onto a lifeboat, but the boat had capsized. And he had spent hours and hours swimming to shore, and he had just gotten here, and that's why he'd come in, and he was soaking wet and so tired because he had just swam all night. And he said he didn't know about any of the other survivors or if there were any other survivors. All he knew is that he was here and he has no idea what else happened. And so Benjamin and the other surfmen immediately gave this man a blanket and some food and some water, and then they quickly sent out a fleet of boats to go search the lake to hopefully find other victims of the shipwreck. That evening and all through the night, Benjamin and his co-workers sailed rescue boats back and forth all across Lake Superior looking for survivors, but all they could find were 4 dead bodies. But the man who had swam to shore and told them about the shipwreck said there had to be more people out there. He said there had been 27 people on this ship, including him, when it had sunk, which meant a lot of people were still definitely unaccounted for. So while some of the surfmen continued to search out on the water, Benjamin and a small team decided they would actually search the coastline itself and see if anybody washed up on shore. And so early on the morning of September 1st, so now the surfmen have been out searching for people for over 24 hours at this point, Benjamin and his team were walking down the coastline and they looked up ahead and they saw what appeared to be 2 people laying on the sand. And so of course they ran up to them, and unfortunately they discovered that, it was a man and a woman who were lying face down in the sand, and they were not breathing. They were dead. And so Ben, he knelt down next to the man and he began rolling his body over to get a look at him. And when he did that, 2 things happened. When he rolled him over and actually got a look at this guy's face, he saw immediately that it was the exact same guy from his dream. The guy who had shaken his hand and pointed out at the lake. It was him, definitely. And as he's having this revelation and he's sort of kneeling there in shock, the man's body, he's sort of rolling it over, and as it completes the rollover, the man's limp hand falls directly onto Ben's hand, like a handshake. Ben would later learn that the ship that sunk out on Lake Superior the night before was called the Western Reserve, and apparently it had sunk during the exact same time that Ben had that nightmare. And the man that Ben saw in his dream, the man that had been pointing out at the lake and shaking his hand in the dream, and then Ben found on the shore dead, who then in his death flopped over and put his hand in his hand all over again, was a guy named Robert Minch, and he was part owner of the Western Reserve ship. For the rest of Benjamin's life, he believed that Robert's spirit had actually visited him in that nightmare to warn him about the shipwreck that was literally happening right then and there. That he was shaking his hand and pointing out at the lake like, hey, go out there right now. There's something horrible happening. A ship is sinking. People need your help. But when Benjamin woke up, despite really feeling like this meant something, this dream was a warning, he didn't actually go out and search the lake. And so as a result, the ship sank. In fact, of the 27 people who were on board that ship that sank, 26 died, including Robert, the owner. The only survivor was that man who swam to shore and told them after the shipwreck had already happened. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1989, a 70-year-old man named Jim Moore and his wife Clara walked along the beach on a tiny island off the coast of South Carolina. It was called Pawleys Island, and it was less than 4 miles long and only wide enough to fit one main road with beachfront houses on either side. Jim and Clara lived in one of those beachfront houses, and every afternoon they would go out and walk the beach together. That particular day, as they walked, Jim could see some clouds gathering off in the distance, right above the ocean. And he'd actually seen a weather report recently about this big storm called Hurricane Hugo that was supposed to be heading their way in the next couple of days. Living on an island, Jim and Clara were pretty used to getting warnings like that. I mean, storms were sort of a big deal on an island because you're pretty isolated. And they were just planning to evacuate if the weather, got pretty bad. But for now, it did seem like the weather wasn't too bad, so they were sticking it out. However, it did sort of seem like basically everybody else on Pawleys Island had taken the storm a little bit more seriously, and most of them had already evacuated. And in fact, as Jim and Clara are walking, I mean, normally they would see lots of people out doing what they were doing, walking the beach, but today, there was just one person really far down the beach, just this one guy walking towards them, but that was it. The rest of the beach was basically deserted. But Jim and Clara were, veterans of Pawleys Island and certainly veterans of other storms that they had weathered in the past, and so they weren't worried yet. And they just continued to, walk down the beach and chat and just kind of stare out at these growing clouds and just have a normal day. But as they're walking, Jim was sort of keeping an eye on this guy, this one other guy on the beach that was walking towards them. Now, he wasn't literally walking towards them, he was just sort of walking in the other direction. And so inevitably, both Jim and Clara and this guy were going to pass each other, and as Jim got closer to this guy, he realized he actually didn't recognize him. And realistically, Pawleys Island was so small that Jim and Clara basically knew everybody, or at least could recognize everybody. But this guy, who was wearing this long gray coat and this wide-brimmed hat, and he kind of had his head down, Jim didn't recognize. And he told Clara, like, hey, who is this guy? As they're walking closer and closer, and she's like, I don't know, I've never seen him before. But, there was no cause for alarm here. It's broad daylight, and who cares if there's a stranger on the island? I mean, of course, people that live here have guests all the time, like this is probably just somebody visiting somebody who lives here. And so they're walking, getting closer and closer. And then finally, when Jim and Clara were about, 10 feet away from this guy, the guy in the big gray coat, Jim, to be polite, just said, hey, how you doing? Because they're the only people on the beach. You can't just ignore each other. But the guy in the gray coat, he just kept that big hat sort of angled down and just briskly walked right past Jim and Clara and didn't even acknowledge them, which is like, there's nobody else here. What are you doing? It's sort of rude. And so Jim and Clara, they look at each other like, that's weird. They keep on walking. And then for whatever reason, Jim just turns around and looks towards this guy, the guy who had just passed them, the guy in the gray coat. And when he looked, he just stopped because the guy was gone and there's nowhere to go. There is no, shrubs or trees or anything. This is a wide open, flat beach. And this guy has just passed Jim and Clara like seconds ago. He can't be anywhere else. He has to be on the beach. There's nowhere to hide. And so Jimmy grabs Clara and he's like, look, he's gone. And she turns around and she's like, what's going on? That's not possible. And they're looking like, did he go in the ocean? But they're looking out in the water and there's no sign of him. The only place, maybe he could have gone is if as soon as he passed by Jim and Clara, he hard turned and ran inland and hid, behind one of the houses. But that's pretty far away. It just didn't seem possible that in that short of an amount of time, he could get up there and hide. And also, why would you do that? That's such bizarre behavior. And so Jim and Clara, they're just standing there like trying to come up with some reasonable theory to explain where this guy went, but they just couldn't do it. It was like this guy just disappeared. And so eventually, Jim and Clara just had to turn back around and finish their walk and make their way home. And the whole time, all they could talk about was this disappearing man in the gray coat, because it defied any rational explanation. Where did he go? When the couple finally got back to their house, by this point, the clouds that had been gathering outside were now very dark, and it really did seem like a serious storm was on the horizon. And then when they turned on the TV, they put on the Weather Channel, and there was this bulletin that the South Carolina state government had actually issued an evacuation order to all inhabitants of Pawleys Island, because apparently Hurricane Hugo was getting bigger and faster and more destructive, and it appeared like Pawleys Island was clearly going to be in the path of this hurricane. And so at this point, Jim and Clara forgot about the gray man and realized like, hey, we got to pack our stuff up and go. We thought we had maybe a day or two before we'd have to evacuate, but no more. we gotta go right now. And fortunately for them, they actually had an adult daughter who lived right on mainland South Carolina. And so they could stay with her on short notice, no problem. And so they quickly packed up, they hopped in their car, and they drove on the one main road until they hit the bridge that went over the ocean. They made their way across the bridge onto mainland South Carolina and over to their daughter's house. And once they got there, their daughter was obviously very happy to see them, happy they were safe. And they would just spend the whole day basically just sitting there with the Weather Channel on, watching reports about Hurricane Hugo. And over the course of the day, the news got more and more dire. Hurricane Hugo was poised to be this enormous destructive storm that was not slowing down at all. And unfortunately, Pawleys Island was really looking like one of the main areas that was going to be affected by this storm. In fact, the meteorologist was saying, like, it is not safe to be on the island at this point. I mean, there's a chance that all the structures on the island could be leveled by the end of this storm. So Jim and Clara, they're obviously happy they are safe, on mainland South Carolina with their daughter, but they live on that island. Their house, everything they own, it's on that island. And so the idea that they were just helpless and their house is going to be destroyed was sort of just terrible. Like, what can you even do? You're helpless. And so as they began to sort of spiral into all their anxieties around what's going to happen, eventually one of them said, hey, let's just accept that we're in this position and let's just change the subject. We're safe here. Don't worry about what the storm's going to do. Let's just change the subject. And the first subject that was raised was Jim and Clara's encounter with that strange disappearing man in the gray cloak. And so Jim and Clara, they told the story to their daughter about this weird guy they saw and how he just kind of vanished. And their daughter was like really interested listening to the story. And when they were done telling it, she looked at her parents and was like, I think you might have seen the gray man. Now, Jim and Clara had lived on Pawleys Island long enough to know about the legend of the Gray Man. As the story goes, 150 years earlier, there was this sailor who was making his way to Pawleys Island to see his fiancée who was there. And when he got to the island, he unfortunately basically fell into quicksand and died. And so the fiancée is totally heartbroken. She's basically losing her mind over the sudden loss of her love. But a couple of days after her fiancé, the sailor, had died, she saw him walking on the beach on Pawleys Island. And he was wearing this long gray coat and this big wide-brimmed hat. And he was walking towards her and she was so overjoyed. She knows it doesn't make any sense, but she runs to her beloved sailor, and right as she reaches him, he disappears. Now, Jim and Clara, they couldn't help but see the overlap here. I mean, they saw, a guy wearing a long gray coat with a big wide-brimmed hat who, was walking on the beach, who then disappeared. It did sort of seem like the legend of the Gray Man, but neither Jim nor Clara really felt like that actually was the explanation here. But at the same time, Jim did feel like, man, that is a weird coincidence. Over the next couple of days, Hurricane Hugo made landfall, and it was absolutely vicious. And then finally, when it passed and it was safe to go back to Pawleys Island, Jim and Clara loaded up their car, they said bye to their daughter, and they made the drive out there. And as they were crossing the bridge to get out to Pawleys Island, along with all the other inhabitants that were going back, they immediately could tell that Pawleys Island really had been leveled. I mean, the roads themselves were badly damaged, there were street signs and trees everywhere, and as they're getting closer, they can see that basically their whole community has been leveled. All the buildings are destroyed. I mean, it's like a war zone. Now, Jim and Clara had sort of braced themselves for this because they had heard on the news that sure enough, this hurricane had been as bad as expected and Pawleys Island had taken a direct hit. And so they drove across the island until they reached their property. And when they got to their property, they could not believe what they saw. So there's actually one more part to the legend of the Gray Man ghost. And that is when the woman saw who she believed was her dead fiancé walking up the beach with his gray coat and his big brimmed hat, and she runs up and he disappears and it's so tragic. That's not the end of the story, because the woman was so upset by seeing what she thought was her fiancé again. He's back from the dead, oh my goodness, and then he vanishes. It's like she had to experience his death a second time, and it made her go crazy. It was like so much grief. It was so overwhelming that she couldn't live with it. And in fact, quickly after seeing, his ghost disappear, she was sent off the island to a hospital. She was basically institutionalized. And while she was off the island, immediately after she left the island, this huge storm rolled through and leveled Pawleys Island, and only one building survived. It was her house. Inexplicably, her house was untouched, completely untouched. Everybody else's ruined. So keep that in mind, because when Jim and Clara returned to Pawleys Island following Hurricane Hugo, whose house was the only house left standing? Theirs. Utterly untouched. Their neighbors' houses, all the local businesses, everything gone. Their house, untouched. And just so you know, the legend of the Gray Man, people believe if you see the Gray Man, he's warning you to leave the island in advance of a storm, like he apparently did for his fiancée. He warned her, get off the island. And if you heed his warning, the legend goes, your house will be spared. And people believe that's exactly what happened to Jim and Clara. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
শোনো, তোমাকে একটা কথা বলি। চুরিবিদ্যা মহাবিদ্যা, যদি না পড়ে ধরো।
আপনার যদি আপনার ছেলের বিষয়ে কথা বলার অধিকার থাকে, তাহলে ওয়াইফ হিসেবে আমার অধিকার আছে আমার হাজবেন্ডের বিষয়ে কথা বলার। গত কয়েকটা মাস আমি তোমার সাথে অ্যাডজাস্ট করে চলছি, আর গত 2টা মাস
একটা পুরুষ মানুষের না এর থেকে বেশি আর কোনো কিছু চাওয়ার থাকে না, কোনো কিছু পাওয়ার থাকে না।
তোমাকে কিচ্ছু করতে হবে না।
না না, তুমি মনে হয় তুমি কষ্ট পেয়েছো, রাইট?
এই শাড়িটা আমি পরে ফেললে তো তুমি সেখানে আর মায়ের গন্ধ পাবে না।
সেটা নিয়ে তোমার একদম ভালো লাগবে না।
তোমরা আবার এসব ভাববে কেন? এই জেনারেশনের মেয়েরা তো এই সমস্ত কথা চিন্তাই করতে পারে না।
মা, তাই তুমি এখানে বসো, ওর জন্য আরেকটা জিনিস আছে।
এরকম চিৎকার করে নীলের সাথে কথা বলছো কেন?
মা, আপনি মুরব্বী মানুষ, আমি আপনাকে হাত
কোনো সিন ক্রিয়েট করিনি বাসার মধ্যে এসে। আমি যেন কোনো সিন ক্রিয়েট না হয় সেটার জন্য আমি তোমাদেরকে কিচ্ছু বলিনি।
সালেহা বেগম, থাক থাক পেছে। আচ্ছা,
মনের বিয়ে নাকি নুনন্তে পান্তে ফোরনো ছেলেটার সংসার করতে কষ্ট হচ্ছে? তোমাদের ঝগড়া দেখবো আর কি। তোমার ভাই ঝগড়া দেখতে আমার ভালোই লাগে এখন। সয়ে গেছে আমার।
আমি আর
তোমাকে বরণ করার জন্য যে এলাকাণ্ড করার কথা, তার কিছুই করতে পারলাম না। আই এম এক্সট্রিমলি সরি।
ওর কাছে আমার শাড়ি গেল কি করে? কি রে নীল, তুই না বলেছিলি এই শাড়িটা নিয়ে আমাকে যখন মনে পড়বে তখন এটার গন্ধ শুন।
আমার বিয়ে তোমাকে একটু সামান্য উপহার, এটা সাদরে গ্রহণ করুন। আপনি ঠিক মতো শুন, আপনার হাত পা একটু আমি টিপা দিই।
থাক, টিপতে হইব না, যা তোর বলতেছে যা।
আরে আমি আসছি তো।
হ্যাঁ।
আমার এই জীবনে না আর কোনো কিছু করার কোনো মরদ নেই, আমার কোনো জায়গাই নেই।
কেন কথা বলবো না? 100 বার কথা বলবো।
কোন সংবিধানে লেখা আছে যে ব্যাচেলারদের বাসা এক কাদা ধুলার আস্তরণ আর ভাজিন? তুমি আমাকে বলেছিলে তুমি আমাকে আগলে রাখবে। তোমার কথায় আমি সব ছেড়ে এক কাপড়ে আমার ঘর।
মা তো প্রায় সময়ই থাকে আমার সাথে। মা তো একটু গ্রামের বাড়ি গেছে, চলে আসবে, টেনশন নেই কিছু না। না খেলে কিন্তু আমার অনেক কষ্ট হবে।
তোমার মা যেগুলো বলে সেগুলোতে বুঝে আমার কষ্ট হয় না? আপনি যে আমার ছোট ছোট বিষয়গুলোতে এত খেয়াল রাখেন, এতেই আমার ভালো লাগে।